also pulling in granny skirts, and they were pulling in fringe jackets, and they were pulling in old army jackets, and top hats, and anything else. And the reason why they were doing that was because they were pulling from their grandparents' closets. So they were rejecting their parents' generation and pulling things from their grandparents' closets and utilizing those, recycling those clothes, so it harkened to a period of time before this. So even though stylistically what they're doing here is very, very different from anything of the Victorian era, we can certainly see elements of Art Nouveau influence in this. And if we look at the whole style of the generation, we can see that they were really playing off of previous generations and what they were working off of. Top hat. They also were playing with new photographic techniques that were being incorporated. So a little bit of some of the things that Man Ray had been doing with solarization, posterization was being utilized, and then taking those bright colors that we see in the pop art and op art movements and incorporating them into the stuff that they were doing. Two of the favorite designers of this era were Victor Moscaso, whose stuff that we see here. He liked to incorporate photography into his work. Just a different trend, not a person that we want to notice, but the idea of doing protest posters, like what we had talked about with Seymour Quast, in trying to capitalize on different techniques or different methodologies for making statement. Here we have a poster that is part of this era that has been made to look like a movie poster, even though it's not really a movie poster, or to take something like this that isn't really promoting a show so much as, again, this idea of concept of what was going on in this time. And this is, again, another way of rejecting the prior generation. Here's that Art Nouveau influence that we were talking about. We can definitely see that whiplash effect that we had seen back in the Art Nouveau era being incorporated into the typography that's happening here. And then Alton Kelly, Stanley Moss, the Grateful Dead, the whole identity of the Grateful Dead came around in this time. And then Rick Griffin, his work here for the Flying Eyeball, which a lot of people refer to this as the Flying Eyeball poster. He became the designer who designed the masthead for Rolling Stone magazine and has gone on to do several things since that time. A lot of these guys that were part of this era, though, they weren't professionally trained as graphic artists. They had some art background, but they really didn't have a lot of production experience at that time. So some of them claimed that the color choices that they had were kind of accidental. They didn't know that if you put a red next to a blue, that those two complements can fight with each other, a red and a green together, those complements might fight with each other. They really weren't quite aware of color theory or how that all kind of works, and so they were just kind of accidentally backing into the answers that they came up with. But all the same, the people adored these posters. And as I started to say before, these posters were really a form of protest, just like what Seymour Quast and Milton Glaze were doing. They weren't just creating posters for the sake of selling something, which is typically how most posters are used. They're usually selling an event or a product. In this particular case, posters like, well, this one's selling an event, this is selling an event, this is not selling an event, this is not selling an event. So the whole idea of using posters for protest purposes is part of this. If we think back to what the lifestyle of the parents of these people would have been like, their parents would have been very upset to have a poster like this hanging in their kid's room, and that was part of the reason why they chose to do this. And then thinking about how they hung posters up. How did any of you hang posters in your rooms when you were growing up? One or two of you. How did you hang them up on the wall?
On tacks.
Right. Right. And thinking about those uptight parents that were part of that 1950s mentality where you're supposed to wear high heels and pearls while you're cleaning your house, how would they expect you to have a poster hung up on your wall?
Framed.
Yeah, framed. with doilies and stuff like that around it. It's like, nope, that doesn't fit the mentality here. Thumbtacks on a wall, pressed into a wall, that's more radical. And so that whole idea of selling posters and just hanging them on the wall, bombarding or filling an entire room with nothing but posters as a graphic, that became a very big part of this era. The whole grassroots idea of posters and why they became very, very popular. All right, so enough about psychedelics. I think you guys get the sense of this and how they kind of tie these together. We're going to start to get into the idea of postmodernism. And postmodernism really started as a result of architecture. It's incorporating the things that we've already seen of the pushpin influence and that pushpin style graphic design, as well as the psychedelic West Coast kind of graphics, as well as pop art and pop art tied together. All of these different things are tied together, but it really, really found its footing in architecture, and specifically in architectural supergraphics. So that by the time we get to the 1981, when MTV came along, this idea was already really filtered into society. What the MTV logo was originally trying to say in its concept was this idea of a giant monolithic M that would fill your entire TV screen, and then the letters TV that were spray painted over top of it. That idea of the giant letter M that filled the entire screen was the idea of supergraphics. And in this particular case, the MTV logo was meant to have a body that the M itself, that monolithic form, was meant to have a body that could change out. And so in its initial variations, that M had different colors, had different patterns, had different imagery that was superimposed into that letter form, and then the spray painted TV kind of represented the street mentality that was kind of coming into it. So in some ways it was the same as what that CBS logo had been way back when, where the CBS logo represented the eye staring at you and you staring at the eye, and so it's back and forth that way. The M in this particular case was the music and the different iterations of what music looked like. And so that's why it picked up. But that idea really was fostered from previous or other ideas that were part of this, the art movement and the pop art movement. For example, Klaus Oldenburg was very famous for doing sculptures that were extremely large. That was part of that pop art mentality, and you know, if we remember Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein, they were doing images that were supersized also. So the paintings that Roy Lichtenstein was doing, or the Campbell soup cans that Andy Warhol were doing, weren't just of these items at their natural size. They were taking them and making them super large. So it makes sense that when Klaus Oldenburg decided to make a political statement or a cultural statement of this free stamp, that he would choose to make it oversized. You can see the scale of it here, and this is downtown Cleveland, by the way. If anybody has never seen this particular sculpture, it is part of our landscape in downtown Cleveland, down by the waterfront near the convention center. So go ahead and go visit it anytime that you want. But again, and you can read all the meaning that you want to in that stamp itself, but ultimately this is another form of pop art. This idea of supersizing really started back in the 1950s, late 1950s, when Chermayeff and Geismar and their other partner, Robert Brownjohn, had created the pavilion for the U.S., the World's Fair, the U.S. Pavilion for the World's Fair in 1958, that year. And the way they chose to do this was to take regular signage, regular graphics that you would see as part of the American landscape, and make them super large so that they created kind of landscape that you could walk around in. And so that was really kind of the theme, and from that idea, other people started to capitalize on that idea. Architectural supergraphics and the postmodern idea really stemmed as kind of a rejection to what was happening in modernist architecture. So when we got past World War II, those folks that had been part of the Bauhaus, that had been kicked out of the Bauhaus and had made their way here, like Ludwig Mies van der Rohe and Walter Gropius, given free rein and opportunity to do what they had initially intended to do, were actually able to build the buildings that they had conceived of as part of that Bauhaus. And so Mies van der Rohe was a champion for this strong monolithic form, these very long rectangular blocks of buildings with glass curtain wall structures. And remember, the Bauhaus itself was, the Bauhaus building was a glass curtain wall building. The walls of the building didn't hold the building up. It was the structure deep inside of the building that held the building up, and the outside was just a sheathing of glass around the outside. So this is the Seagram building in New York City, which is considered, one of the better pieces of architecture at this time. However, this became the emblem of what modern architecture started to become. So every building started to look like this big monolithic structure. And we can see, walk into any city in America and you're going to see a building that looks very similar to this. Big monolithic structure with a glass sheathing on the outside. Nothing really all that interesting. And so these folks that were part of the postmodern architecture, they were seeing this and they were getting really, really bored with the same kind of building over and over again. It's like, how many different iterations can we do of the same thing? In the case of Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, he did things like he would open up the space in front of the building so that when you got out of a cab, your eye was soared up to the top of the building. You had all this plaza space underneath, and as you walked closer to the building, the atrium space underneath the building became a part of the building itself, and it was as if the building was floating above you. But not every building had the luxury of having that much space around it, or as creative an architect to be able to do those things. So again, it just started to become sameness after a while. So interior designers started to play with this, and architects as well started to play with this and said, okay, well, what happens if we start to use supersized graphics inside of the building? So we're just going to paint the interior space using some of the things that we're seeing from the Swiss designers, the idea of letter forms or shapes or lines, and make them so that they overwhelm the space, so that they become super large within the space. We're still holding true to this modernist aesthetic, but now we're taking things at a very large scale. And this became a part of the architectural fabric after a while, taking these architectural graphics and making them supersized. And over again, we see example after example of architects and interior designers or even signage designers who are taking this idea of making something super large in scale. However, that got boring after a while too. It became kind of predictable. So the architects continued to look for ways to make their designs more interesting. And two of the designers that really, actually three, but the two that we're going to focus here that really started to take advantage of questioning modernism and at the same time respecting modernism were Robert Venturi is one, but I don't think I have any examples for him. Michael Graves and Philip Johnson. I showed you Philip Johnson's name already because he was one of the people that was part of that Seagram building in New York City. But Michael Graves was really a leader in this regard. Michael Graves had a respect for modernist architecture, and that he recognized that as far as building goes, it was great. That this whole idea of the curtain wall system, the sheathing on the outside of the building, made a whole lot of sense to how you would actually construct the buildings. The buildings went up much faster, much easier as a result of having this kind of structural support system underneath, but it was what was on the outside that he decided that he wanted to change around. So architecturally, structure-wise, this is the same thing, but the way he started to apply the features on the outside of the building changed entirely. So looking at this building itself, let's identify what makes this different from that building that we saw before that was of the Mies van der Rohe, Philip Johnson building, the secret building. What makes this one different from that? What do we see? What do you see, Paul?
Angles.
Angles, yeah, that idea of what's happening at the top there. Anybody else notice anything about this building that sets it apart from what was happening with the Seagram building that we looked at a minute ago? What do you see, Pete?
There's multiple materials and colors.
Yeah.
It's
That brick.
monolithic.
It looks like brick, yes. Yes, brick on a high-rise building. I'd say, dare say, a good 30, 40 story tall building.
Vintage, whatever is the term, right?
What's that?
They call it vintage now, I think.
So the aesthetic that
Yeah,
they're
right,
applying?
yeah.
So what's it vintage of? What does it remind you of?
Old world Europe.
Mhm. Yeah. Anybody here seeing like something that kind of reminds them of, old brick houses, manor
The
houses?
church burned down in France. What's it?
The Notre Dame?
Yeah.
Not quite to that. I have another one that's kind of like that. What else?
Well, it's kind of like a massively scaled up version of those little houses that dot the canals in.
Sure.
Venice.
Yeah. So like in Amsterdam and
Oh,
that.
yeah.
Mhm. The roof lines. Anybody else see anything else in this? So some people might even say that it's not even like the canal houses, although it is.
It's German, almost Austrian.
It looks like a kid's drawing of a house in some ways, doesn't it?
Like a gingerbread house.
Yeah. Look at how oversized those windows are. Now, here's the thing. Those windows that are on this are actually 2 stories tall.
Oh wow.
So we're thinking, it looks like it's just a regular kid's kind of drawing or gingerbread house kind of thing, but those, in reality, those things are 2 stories high. 2 stories high. So you can see from this window, you can see out the window, and from this window, you can see out the window, and here's a floor that's in between those spaces. The exterior, again, is a curtain wall system. The sheathing on the outside is not holding the building up. That's like a faux brick, or it could actually be whole brick, but usually when they're doing curtain walls, it's just a faux. So it's not necessarily all of that. The idea of a pitched roof, like what we have here, well, there's a reason why buildings, high-rises, don't have pitched roofs. Can anybody think of a reason?
Wait, I mean the physics of it must be ridiculous.
It's not that. There's a really big, important, dangerous reason why high-rises do not have pitched roofs. Well, let's just say, for example, if you have a 3-story house with a pitched roof and you don't have gutters on your house in the wintertime, think about sheets of ice coming down from the top of that building onto the ground. High-rises do not have pitched roofs because of the idea of rain conditions and snow and so on, that water that can seep off or slide off, and the danger it would have for people underneath. That movie, A Christmas Story, be careful, you'll shoot your eye out, and he gets hit by an icicle. Be careful, those things are dangerous. Like, kid can get impaled by it. The lines from that movie. But the idea, just from a single story of having an icicle coming down and hurting you, imagine it from 30 or 40 stories high. So there's a reason why buildings don't have pitched roofs like this. A lot of times people, the buildings also had flat roofs because they could actually use them to collect water. So they used them for part of the sanitation system in the building. So that was not an unusual thing either. So this has all of that stuff. It's just kind of hiding behind that pitched roof system. That roof is there for no reason at all. And they actually have guards there to keep ice from building up on the outside of the building, but all the same, it's there for aesthetic purposes only. Here's another building that is doing the same type of thing. This one's by Philip Johnson. And Adam, you pointed out Notre Dame. Look at the peaks and the ridges at the top of that building. Is it there for any particular reason? None. It's serving no purpose at all. And so in some ways, what we're doing is we're creating that same kind of thing that was going on way back in the Victorian age when they were creating embellishments and elements on the outside of their buildings, their houses, just because they could. And this becomes kind of a mantra of what postmodernism starts to become. It's not form follows function anymore, because having that roof line on the top of the AT&T building shown here, now the Sony building shown here, is not necessary for any functionality of the building. It's just there because they wanted it there. Whereas the modernist, Mies van der Rohe, they would have said, why is this thing here? What is it saying about this building? What purpose does it serve? Form follows function became really the mandate for modernism. simplify, 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 to the point that only the things that were functional were part of the building. This serves no purpose at all, that ridge line at the top. And when people saw this original building in New York, and the plans for it, in New York City, they were up in arms about it. They felt like it was so contrary to every other building in New York City that it was going to stand out like a sore thumb. Well, it does. It does stand out like a sore thumb, but New Yorkers, they get over things, and now they're very prideful of this building because it does stand out so much. And this has become, again, another thing that people that are practicing architecture now are doing. They don't want their buildings to look like everybody else's buildings. They want them to stand apart. In the case of Michael Graves, again, he just kind of tossed aside that whole notion of form follows function, and he started to work in what we would call a modernist sensibility of trying to simplify form, but at the same time, it's simplifying form, but without necessarily having a reason for having those simplified forms. So in this case, he's got all these different sizes of windows that are all part of the same building. Different kinds of roof lines that are all part of the same kind of building. He has different shapes of rooms that are all part of the same building. And the reason for it, just because. Here's another one that he designed, where if we were really to pare this down and look at it hard, we would recognize that all the windows are the same kind of windows, that the building is shaped the same kind of way, but that he's dissecting it out and having different kinds of materials used on the exterior of the building to create this color sensibility that's happening here. And that we've got this colonnade that's happening on the facade of the building that is holding nothing up. So it's not holding up a roof, it's not doing anything, it's just there because it's reflective of Greek temples. It's got that kind of feel to it. But if we look at those columns, or the columns that are here, we'll recognize that there's nothing at the top of those columns. And if we looked back on Greek temples, we would know that each one of those temples, they had all kinds of decorative flourishes and fluting that was on the colonnade. In fact, you can see here that the colonnade is holding nothing up, that this is a wall that's behind it. And so the exterior of the building is just a series of half columns that are there simply for the aesthetic appeal of them. So the surface of these columns is very bare, it's very blank, but at the same time we still get a sense of history from this. We can reason that he's trying to replicate or say something about an aspect of history, but he's taking it to a new modern sensibility. Ultimately, he designed spaces because they felt right. And what ends up coming out of this as a result is that we get this kind of eclectic, eccentric kind of style that starts to develop as a result, always based upon geometric form. So again, if we were to go backwards, we see that everything has a very geometric form. Even where it looks like that there are beamwork and so on that comes out, that they're very squared off shapes. That everything is based upon squares, and so we can see very much that there's geometric form in everything that's being done in the buildings that are being constructed here. And at the same time, they still are kind of reminiscent of something else. They speak to us of a time, of a period past. So this idea of revering the past or understanding the past is incorporated in what they're doing. But again, now it's no longer for function purposes, it's just for the sake of doing something that feels right. The last thing that we need to talk about before we start to break this apart and really get into the nitty-gritty about postmodernism and understanding all the different forms of postmodernism is we have to recognize the tech revolution and how important this was. I'm going to put this aside for a second and close this down so I can show for a second. I just want to see if I can bring this up. Play this.
Glorious anniversary of the information all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each one may bloom, secure from the pests of any conflict. tell you one cause. Our hands shall fold themselves together, but we will prevail with an open conscience. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
Okay. So it's important to look at that commercial because that had a profound effect on the way that how the graphics world changed as a result of that. So we saw that clip also when we were watching the movie Art and Copy, and they talked a little bit about this. Anybody know anything about this movie that they can throw out, or just the information that we learned from the movie? Yeah.
Yeah, just that Ridley Scott directed that. He's won many Oscars. Gladiator, Blade Runner.
Yeah, this is before he was actually a major
Yeah.
movie
Yeah.
director, producer. So this is like one of the places where he got his start. But the production values in this particular commercial, this 1-minute commercial, are of the same quality that you would see in a major motion picture.
He won an Oscar for Best Picture.
Yeah, this commercial cost $1.5 million to produce.
That was a lot of money back then.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. What else do we know about this? Where was it shown?
So it's a Super Bowl commercial.
It was the Super Bowl. It was for Super Bowl 17. And why did they choose to show it there? Because they knew that they were going to get a big viewership out of it. Did they show it anyplace else? No, they didn't. Actually, they did. They did. They showed it in some little podunk town in Minnesota or something like that at 3 o'clock in the morning because it was the cheapest place that they could put it on television. They had to do it within the span of like the next week or so they showed it there. And the reason they did that was because they wanted to be able to enter it into competitions. And so in order to do that, you had to prove that you had advertised more than it wasn't just a one-off. So they showed it twice. So how did this thing develop buzz? Why was this commercial so profound and so different? What do you think, Mark?
Nobody knew what the product actually was. They didn't show it. They just kind of like showed all this. People probably didn't even know what it meant.
Right, right. So this is before computers, before we had these devices sitting on our desktop all the time. It was something new. Yeah.
They didn't actually show like the product in the commercial.
Very good. Yeah. So we never see the computer actually in the commercial. So how do we know that this is about computers?
See the logo at the end. It's the only
Yeah.
slight tell, if anything.
There had been some buzz, some industry talk about this new device, this new computer that's being produced by a company called Apple. And so people had some clue as to what it was coming, but they had no idea really what the Apple computer was going to do. And this commercial didn't show what it looked like. And so people, were kind of going into that press conference that happened on January 24th with no expectations or no idea of what it was. The only promise that Apple was making in that commercial was that they were going to blow their competition away. Who was their competition?
That one is IBM and
Who was it?
Macintosh.
Was it?
Macintosh?
No, Macintosh was the computer that Apple
IBM
created. So
partially.
IBM. It was IBM. How do we know it was IBM? Anybody remember that period or know anything about that period? I bet you guys weren't even born yet. You're all so young. What do you know about that? About IBM?
For some reason, I remember one of my professors saying that IBM and Steve Jobs started around the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's all I can remember.
Yeah. So how else do we know that it was competing with it?
Well, IBM was the corporate model of it today in the computer industry. They're sort of like the big kahuna. And Apple is sort of like, well, today we call startup.
Mm-hmm.
And it was this, I actually read Steve Jobs' autobiography years ago.
Yeah.
It was like a little guy taking on the big guy.
It's a David and Goliath story that was
Yeah.
going on here. And isn't that what they're portraying right here is the David and Goliath story with the hero here as, just a girl. Just a girl. She's taking on the monster, taking on the big brother. So what's this in reference to? What's this whole commercial in reference to? Yeah.
1984.
Which
George
was
Orwell.
a book by George Orwell.
the movie had just come out, was like it was only a year or two before
Mm-hmm.
that, so it was still like pretty present.
Fresh in people's heads, right?
And yeah, it's all about conformity, and since the Super Bowl was like the first or second week of 1984, I'm saying this is why this isn't going to be like the books or like the movie says. It is.
Yeah, very good. Yes, all of that. It comes down to the fact that 1984 had been a book that was produced by George Orwell back in 1934, 50 years before that time, and his prediction about the future and saying how conformist we were already. He was already seeing us be back in that time, and how we were all going to become kind of zombified by the time we get to this 1984, 50 years into the future for him. And so it was a warning shot to the world about how we have to fight back, this kind of totalitarian governments and totalitarian kind of viewpoints, so that we're not just mindless drones. And so all the characters in here are mindless drones. They're pale and hasty-faced and weak-looking and just kind of marching in lockstep, and all have the same blank expressions on their faces. The color palette here is blue and gray. For most everything in the film, it's blue and gray, which were the corporate colors of IBM at that time. Yeah, so blue and gray were the colors of this corporate color palette, and so they're not pointing to IBM directly, but they're certainly implying the idea of IBM in this. IBM was the only manufacturer of personal computers at that time. There was no other competition. So when you said the words PC, personal computer, that meant IBM. For everybody knew PC and IBM were interchangeable things. They meant the exact same thing. And so by taking on the PC world, Apple was waging war against IBM. And so by having this character that is young, vital, athletic, colorful, wielding power through her hammer, and literally destroying the screen just as the big brother is saying, "We shall prevail," and then it blows up in everybody's faces, and the look of shock by the entire audience that's looking at all of this. This is Macintosh's message to IBM. Whether it really fulfilled everything that it was trying to say in this commercial, well, that's another question entirely, but it was how they launched it. Actually, Apple had not been invented in 1984. It was invented back in 1976 by three partners, Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and Ronald Wayne. Wozniak and Jobs stayed together. Ronald Wayne sold off his shares pretty early into the game. But their first computer they actually built in the garage. It was called the Apple I Personal Computer Kit, and it was shown at the Homebrew Computer Club. So it was a geeky kind of club. The original Apple computer was nothing more than a motherboard, which had CPU, RAM, and basic textual video chips. That was it. So you got a motherboard, and then you had, as a personal computer user, you had to create your own keyboard. You had to create your own monitor. So a lot of people use television sets that they would hook up, and then they were hooking up IBM keyboards to this television set to make it operate. You can see here their original logo. Or maybe you can't see the original logo. Can anybody see what that logo was supposed to be?
It's ice and new, the apple falling out of the tree onto them, I think.
Yeah, so what's that supposed to imply?
Brilliant's laws of physics, the whole idea, concept, whatever you want to call it, light bulb.
So, yeah, it's kind of the light bulb going off. So I'm sure a lot of you guys can't even really see that apple that's on hanging over Newton's head, and how supposedly that's how he discovered or came up with the theory of gravity. Was an apple fell from the tree into his lap, and he realized, oh, why didn't the apple float upwards, and why did it always fall down? Why do things always fall down? And that's where the concept of gravity came from. At least that's what we think. But we can also associate the idea of apples with the idea of knowledge. If we go back to the biblical story and taking the bite out of the apple. And so they got rid of the Newton idea and instead went along with that idea of taking a bite out of an apple to gain wisdom. So within that year, they decided that logo with Newton was not going to work for them, and so they instead went into this direction. And they showed that apple, the redesign of the Apple logo. And so not only were they showing Apple as a sign of wisdom, but they were also showing the span of color that now was opened up to you as a result of taking that bite out of the apple. And in fact, the first slogan was bite into an apple, spelled B-Y-T-E, as in kilobytes, megabytes, gigabytes, bytes, B-Y-T-E, bite into an apple. That was their original slogan. In any case, when that first computer came out in 1984, this is what people were shown at that original show. And if you ever want to see like how amusing it was, how people reacted to it, Google search Apple introduction January 24th, 1984.
I actually used one before.
Yeah.
Yeah, my buddy had one going. Yeah, I've actually used one of those.
Me too. So do you remember how much memory was on these
250 maybe. That was
250 what?
megabytes or whatever. It wasn't a full gig.
Try like 700 kilobytes.
Okay, that makes sense.
Was the size of this computer. That was it maxed out.
Yeah.
So if you had a computer that's 700 kilobytes, I mean you can barely move your mouse on 700 kilobytes. Let alone try to save something. I think you can save a block of type that doesn't have much styling
It's
to it.
like a Model T, basically, is what.
Yeah, it's a really poor amount of memory space. But at that time, that was, that they thought that was really a big deal. So again, if you really are interested in seeing what this was like, what the experience was like, Google search Steve Jobs introduction, Apple or Macintosh computer, 1984. And they show you the entire press conference that happened, the entire event, and people were cheering. They were like standing on their chairs, screaming and crying. They were so happy about this computer because it was so different from what PCs were like. This computer, they introduced it, they played the theme music from, it was another movie about runners and
Chariots of Fire.
that's the one. Chariots of the music, so it's da, da, do, 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 do. And so the music kind of plays and they introduce the computer and it comes out and it starts to launch up and it starts to spell out the letters hello. And this is everything that's different from what a PC is.
I think it spoke too. I think it said over the top.
It did. They allowed it to speak, so it had a script that had a little.
It's like Hello World or something. I think is what. Is that the original one?
It's the one that you're.
Yeah, it's Hello World. You typed into
but it says, "Hello, my name is Mac, and I'm here to introduce you to a person who's been more than a father to me, Steve Jobs." And so Steve Jobs comes on and takes over the talking, but the computer started the show. They were able to show slideshows of what this computer was all about and what it could do. And the reason why people are so excited about this and why that scripted hello that came across the screen was so exciting, it was part of the startup of the computer, was because the whole idea of having a friendly computer was completely outrageous to people. Anybody here ever done HTML coding before or JavaScript coding before? What happens if you hit a wrong character?
I tried it a couple of times. It didn't work. I dropped it.
Christopher, what happens?
Like create a page.
If you try to do anything on the computer and you hit the wrong keys in, or you don't hit a backslash or a closed bracket on something, what happens?
You get depressed.
There would be nothing on the page.
Nothing happens. And this is the thing. This is how people had to operate before Macintosh came along, because it was all about sitting in the computer and typing in code. And if you hit one character wrong, everything would stop. Nothing would advance, and you have to go back and read lines and 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 lines of script to try to figure out what you did wrong when you hit the enter key. Why was it not processing? Why was it not spitting something out? Why was it not doing the function that you had just set it up to do? So the idea of having a screen where you could see everything that was on the screen and you could control it with a mouse, this is new. Nobody had done this before. This is what we call WYSIWYG, or what you see is what you get.
Supposedly.
Yeah. The whole story of the mouse and all of that is the whole history behind Macintosh, but all the same, this is the first computer that was actually utilizing a mouse and a keyboard and using that mouse to get you from one thing to another thing, that you could move your hand and the mouse would follow and you could click on it and it would activate something. That was new. People hadn't seen that before. And so people were really excited about this because it was so friendly. The problem, anybody know what the problem was with this computer besides the fact that it had such small memory?
It's proprietary.
No. Any thoughts? No, that's a good idea. What was it?
The price?
The price? It was sold for less than $1,000. So that was a lot of money then. But people didn't know what to do with it. It's like, okay, so other than a couple of softwares that were built into it, they really didn't know what they were supposed to do with it. And even if they did, like, start to create imagery and stuff like that with it, then how do you get it from the computer screen to something else? Yep, the printer.
But Apple made dot matrix printers eventually for it. I mean,
so shortly after that, within the year, they realized, oh, we have one big fatal flaw here, and that is that we don't have a way to print the things that are happening here. So we can tell people to take everything, put it on a floppy disk, and send it off to somebody that's going to print it, but the people need to be able to actually see what it is that they're creating on their computer. So that's shortly after that they created the laser writer. And for a while there, the Macintoshes were sold in bundles so that you could get the laser writer and you could get a whole mess of software. So for that $1,000 price tag, or maybe $1,200, you could buy like 4 different softwares and a laser printer along with your Macintosh computer that came with the monitor and the mouse and the keyboard and all of that kind of stuff. The other fun part about that computer was it was portable. It doesn't seem like it would be, but it was actually just like a little small box. It was only like this big and this tall as it was, and it came with a carrying case, so it came with a carrying bag. So you could put it in its own little bag, and then you could zip it up and carry it around with you, supposedly. And this was one of the things that people also liked about it, because when they did it, they literally pulled the computer out of the bag, plugged it in on the stage, and made it run in front of all these people. And people hadn't seen that before, because usually there were like 10 different cables that all had to be hooked up to your computer, and you had a long login, and it didn't happen with this new computer. This new computer, press a button and it started up and it said hello. All right, so but the other thing that happened even then was that Steve Jobs realized that if he wanted this computer to succeed, and especially the fight against IBM, that he needed to build something called brand loyalty. What's brand loyalty? What's brand loyalty?
it's like, it's like guys who, it's like you're a Ford person or a Chevy guy, it's some sort of like, for lack of better words, a religious draw.
Yeah. So how many of you guys are hard and true Apple users? Yeah, so hands raised. Why?
Okay, well, I had an Apple II GS as a kid. I like the hot rod version of that.
Yep.
And basically came from my mom, who was an ex-programmer during the 70s. And she used to work on the big mainframes. And she used to put punch cards in. She used to burst like call in the middle of the night when it wouldn't work. So like, it became called, family legacy. Or we also had PCs too. So it was kind of, after I found the creative medium, it just became, for a number of years, the right tool for the job. And now Apple's coming back into it with their new tower. They're supposed to bring out in the fall.
Okay.
But PC's sort of, Microsoft's coming back a little bit.
So
That's sort of,
for
that's
your
a side.
family, it became nostalgic or part of the legacy.
Yeah.
Anybody here have another reason why they Why do you choose Apple?
I've just used like Androids and stuff before, and I just feel like Apple, it just makes it simpler to figure everything out.
Okay.
And everything's just like connected with all your devices.
Okay.
I was gonna say, everything's connected.
Okay, so it's really easy to operate. That was, again, one of those things that Macintosh, that Apple did. They coined the phrase user-friendly. That was them. So they made it possible for that. Anybody else have other reasons why they choose an Apple computer or Apple for their products? Okay, so what Jobs was trying to do was trying to get the youth market, and to try to capitalize on that idea of legacy and make it so that people wouldn't even think about going to a PC for their choices. So one of the first things that he did was he introduced the Apple computers into the schools. He started in California where they were at, and he gave away a free Macintosh computer to every school in California, and then he started to do it to every school in the country. And then he started to give away multiples of those computers, so that when kids were starting to learn how to use the computers, the first computer that they would work off of was a Macintosh computer, trying to get those kids early on to buy into the market. Here's a picture of one of the first portable computers. It was really bulky, weighed something like 25 pounds. And
Paperweight.
yeah, so not necessarily really a portable computer, but it was a first step. And we're not really going to get into the whole dynamics behind Jobs and how he lost his job and all of that stuff, or how he came back. What we will say is that Apple Corporation faced some problems in its first years, and a lot of it had to do with how willing the company was to take risks and how willing they were to stretch out of the bounds of what IBM was doing and do their own thing. And it was really when Steve Jobs was at the helm that they started to become a very visionary company. For example, Steve Jobs hired designers like Clement Mock to work for him. And his decision was to put design first in the way that they were going to present the computers. And so to this very day, whenever we buy an Apple product, we're still seeing the results of this. His original packaging just showed their logo on the outside of the package, or it just showed they capitalized on that name, on creating some kind of an aura associated with their brand. Anybody here bought a Macintosh computer recently, or any kind of Apple product? Do you notice anything about the packaging?
Still pretty much the same, pretty blank, with just an apple on the front.
They're all white. They have this like they got snapped.
Yeah.
Photos.
Yeah, so their original stuff looked like this, where they had some kind of a graphic like that. But if we start to dissect it, we can recognize that this is a soft pocket effect. Object style posters, right? And that's how they advertise now. And if we look at that, again, the movie that we saw, Art and Copy, and we saw like them putting together the advertisements for the iPods, and how they turned that into a whole advertising campaign. All we saw was a person dancing, and we could make out the iPod, which was white on this field of black body and colorful palette. And we didn't even see the logo, but we knew what they were selling. And that really was what Macintosh, or what Apple was trying to do, what Steve Jobs was trying to do, was to try to get people so that they would recognize this product without them even having to show the name of the product, that people became so caught up in this product that they were willing to buy the product even though it didn't actually say what it was on the outside of the package. So if you look at a Macintosh package or an iPhone package or whatever, you'll see nothing but a picture of that product, and you have to turn it on its side to actually see that this isn't a PowerBook or that this is an iPhone or whatever. It doesn't say anywhere on the outside. It has nothing on the outside except for those things. The logo on the back package, the picture of the product on the front, and then the words that say what it is on the side package. They also wanted to make it possible for people to be able to operate this machine really, really easily. So again, user functionality, user friendliness, that was one of the things that they were playing with. They made it so that literally you had opened up a box, you had a plug, you had the device, And if there was any kind of a manual, it showed pictograms that showed you plug this in, push this button, start it up, it runs. And everything about it was meant to be intuitive. So you didn't have to push a lot of buttons, you didn't have to type a lot of stuff in to make it work. It talked to you, it walked you through the process of how to use it and how to make this product work to your benefit. And that was the thing that really sold people. This idea of friendliness and ease of use, that was part of it. They introduced it at, probably the first place that they showed it was at a show that was happening in Aspen, Colorado, where it was a computer show, and they had some of the biggest names in the design industry walking through that show, and they had a whole setup right here, where people could sit down and play on the computer and start to do things that they would do in their office with it, and that also sold it to a lot of people. So the design industry bought onto it really fast because they could start to use it for digitally creating logos and graphics. And one other just slam on IBM has nothing to do with the Macintosh, but the reason why Macintosh was so eager to show a friendly computer was because of that movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. So, remember that movie? Do you remember what the name of the computer was?
HAL.
HAL? Yeah. Why did they name it HAL? I mean, Stanley Kubrick chose that name on purpose. Does anybody know why? This is, again, a statement about...
geek stuff.
Do you know why?
Oh, I don't know. That sounds like hell though.
No. Anybody else know the reason why it was called HAL? What's the next letter after HAL?
Something artificial, something.
HIABLM. IBM. It was making HAL. HAL is like just a kind of his own Stanley Kubrick's little dig at IBM and how much he hated those computers. So the world was very happy to see this friendly, happy computer come along. That was part of the reason why it sold so well. However, there were problems that occurred with this new computer, especially in the PC, in competition with PCs. It had the IBM PC and others that started to follow after that. They were all working off of a different kind of platform from what Macintosh was working from. And so it became a very big cultural divide. It was kind of like, are you a Beatles fan or a Rolling Stones fan kind of debate. And those folks that are Rolling Stone fans, they think that the folks that are Beatles fans are silly. And the same thing for Beatles fans, they think the same with Rolling Stones. Not that there's anything wrong with either one of those, but in the computer world, that's where they were at. So you were either a PC user or you were a Macintosh user. And that was fine for a while, until the internet came along. And when the internet came along, then they introduced this new thing called websites. And websites work regardless of whether you're working on an IBM PC or a Macintosh. The problem is the components to make those websites run are based upon the components that are built in your system. So if you're working on a PC system, the computer will operate based off of the fonts that you have, at least in those days, based off of the fonts that are embedded into your computer. And the same thing for a Macintosh. Macintosh created its own fonts to operate from. It didn't want to have anything to do with Microsoft or the PC world. And the same thing for PC world, they weren't using the same fonts. So if you were creating a website on a Macintosh computer, you could make it look beautiful on your Macintosh computer, but as soon as it went to a PC computer, it looked like trash. And the same thing is true if you created a website from a PC computer and then you imported it, or somebody logged in from a Macintosh computer and looked at that website. It fell apart. It was just a piece of garbage. So they needed to be able to find a way to get these two computers to talk, because Macintoshes weren't going away, PCs weren't going away, and they needed to find a way to do this. So they hired a guy named Matthew Carter, who is a very famous type designer, and he came in and he developed several fonts that worked really nicely between the two computers. It was kind of their neutral territory. Everybody agreed we're all going to load our computers with these same two fonts. And so they got to the point where typekit fonts and cross-pull of fonts and embedded fonts and all of that stuff came into the picture. You had to rely upon fonts that worked, and Verdana was one of those fonts. Verdana, the beauty of Verdana is that it was designed so that it has these very high X heights, that's the lowercase letters on it, so that when you take it down to a very small point size, you can still read it really well, and if you take it up to a really large size, that those bit mapping softens out and you can still read it just as beautifully, so it works really nicely between small size and large size, and the font had all of this stuff already built into it, so it became responsive. Very early on, before anybody was doing responsive design work. And then to complement it, he developed this other font, Georgia, that was meant to be the complement to Verdana. So Georgia and Verdana work together. They have the same X height, the lowercase letters. And in essence, Georgia is the serif version of what Verdana is meant to be. So given all of that, those things kind of came together to create this new world of technology, and it gives us the basis for the traits that we're going to see that are part of postmodernism, which look like this. And as we move in on Monday's class and start to talk about the different styles of postmodernism, we want to recognize these traits are the underlying qualities that we see in postmodernism. That is, that there is a response to the commercialism of modern culture and society, and that it's being done through exaggeration, as shown through postmodern architecture, through super graphics, through pop art, through psychedelics, through all of the things that we've looked at. We've seen this idea of exaggeration, bending the forms, taking them to a scale that is beyond what they're supposed to be. We also see through, thanks to Pushpin, this kind of return to illustration techniques. We also see a push against the austerity of modernism, so both American and European forms, that idea of just paring things down to the most minimal form and not adding in any additional embellishment, that's gone away. And now people are starting to add additional things in, not because it helps enhance the building in any way, like colonnades on the front of the building, but just because it creates something that's different. There is a reverence and a reflection of past design styles with an understanding of history, hence the grassroots psychedelic movement and how they were referencing Art Nouveau, secessionist style, and even in fashion, they're referencing things from 100 years back. We see it with the Pushpin group, where they're pulling styles from different parts of art history and design history into the work that they're doing. And so we see, and then of course postmodernism, where they're reflecting colonnades and silos and things that are not really tied to the building necessarily, but there's a tie to history and what they're doing. The outcomes of postmodernism are definitely technology-driven. And that can be a positive form of technology-driven, meaning that we're embracing what the computer can do, or it can be a rejection of technology, meaning we're pushing away from what the computer can do. And then lastly, that mantra, form follows function, no longer need apply. It's not being used ever again in postmodernism. So those are the traits that we're going to look at. I'll just introduce this slide as well. So this is where we start to get away from the book. The book will tell you that postmodernism looks like a bunch of different things. I'm going to tell you that there are 5 styles to postmodernism that we need to look at. They are new wave typography, this California Memphis style, retro style, grunge, and DIY. They all happen at different times, but they're all inspired or influenced from one to the next. So they pretty much go in this order: new wave to California to retro to grunge to DIY. And again, I'm pointing out style. So what is a style again? What is a style? Remember isms versus styles?
Totally drawing blanks.
Anybody remember what the difference is between an ism and a style? What is it, Treat?
An ism is more like a mentality.
Mm-hmm.
The style is just like the way you design something.
Right, it's the superficial or the surface qualities. So in saying that these 5 styles are part of postmodernism. We're saying that postmodernism is the overall prevailing guideline. These traits that I pointed out, they're the overall guiding principle that each one of these styles is going to embody, but they're going to do it in a different way. Each one's got their own unique way of going about this. Okay? So that's where we're going to leave it today. And we'll pick up again on Monday, and we're going to start talking about new wave typography.